Right, so let me get started. So yes, going to talk about cross-platform configuration files, and obviously the first question you might want to ask is, what will they be? So they will be files containing the configuration settings for the Dyalog environment that are portable across different platforms. I think so far I've not told you anything that's not in the title. But also, they will be human-readable and writable. They will be simple to distribute. They can be applied per application, and they can be cascaded. I'll elaborate on a couple of those in a moment, but first, why on earth should we come up with another way of setting options in the interpreter? Currently, the reason being, what we've got makes it very easy to configure your local APL for your entire system, but it's not very good for anything else, for distributing and for having multiple configurations with different applications. You have to mess with scripts or command line options or change the registry. And it's different on different platforms. So what we're coming up with is something that is easier to use and will be consistent across all platforms. And when will you be able to have them? Well, next year. At the moment, I'm basically just thinking aloud. There is no implementation to show you at this stage. So what do you have to do today? Well, let's read the documentation. This is the Windows documentation. You can change the parameters, that's the configuration settings, in 4 ways. Using the configuration dialog box. So that's your options setting in the IDE. Very good for setting your local development environment. You can edit the registry directly. That is, again, affects your whole system, very Windowsy. You can put parameters on environment variables, and if you're distributing an application, that's probably what you start doing. You create a batch file with all the settings in that then starts the interpreter. And you can put parameters on the APL command line, which is in fact very similar to setting environment variables, with the added restriction that you might have a line length limit. So let's now think about Windows, Unix. So we don't have that at all on the Unix interpreter. We don't have a registry, but we have something different. We have a configuration file within the user's home directory. You can set environment variables, but you have to specify them all in uppercase. And you can also use the command line with a possibly different line length limit. So although the documentation says this provides a great deal of flexibility, we want to provide a greater deal of flexibility. So I made a little space to put that in. There you go. So, what slide are we up to? 6. So, let's consider, if we have these configuration files, how they would be used. Where would you put the things? What we are thinking is that it would pick up one automatically without you even having to specify it if there is a configuration file found in the current working directory when the interpreter starts up. So on Windows, that might typically be something like that directory. If you put one in there, it'll just get picked up automatically. Perhaps more interestingly, if you start the interpreter referencing a workspace and there is a configuration file in the same place as the workspace, it'll implicitly pick it up from there as well. So if you start path to workspace and it finds path to perhaps dialog.config, it'll automatically load the options. It'll probably only do one of those. It says whichever was done first. When I went through these this morning, I thought, that's backwards. But something like that will happen. Okay, so configuration files will also be loaded if you give them as your startup file. And this ties in with something Morten mentioned this morning, that we want to be able to start the interpreter on more than just a workspace. So if you point the interpreter directly at your configuration file, and the configuration file will then be able to chain what actually gets started by specifying the actual startup target afterwards. And it's worth pointing out, we are not going to take away any existing functionality. This has all got to fit together with what we've currently got. Right, so one other thing, if we're going to do that, we've got to think, well, how will they fit in with the existing things? At the moment, the interpreter looks at the registry or dialog config, depending on which platform you're on, and it looks at that first, and then it looks at environment variables, and then it looks at the command line. And as that is the order it does the things, that means that the registry has the lowest priority because it could get overwritten by later settings. And so the most likely place to fit in the configuration files would be the implicitly ones after the registry, but still overridable by environment variables and the command line. And then if you explicitly specify a configuration file, that will be the highest priority. Okay, and one other thing, I mentioned that they were cascading. That simply means that if you've got two applications with each has got a configuration file, but there's a lot of commonality between them, you might want to break out the common stuff into a separate file. So we can put the common stuff in one file, have two separate configuration files that reference that file, and makes it a lot easier to manage the common options. That's the idea. We've got a lot more to sort out. First of all, we need to worry about what the file format will be. We are thinking JSON. There's lots of good reasons for it being JSON. It is human readable and easily edited. That was one of our objectives. It can describe both character and numeric data, which sounds good. In fact, with environment variables, we don't have that capability, so it will give us a bonus there. The interpreter can already read and write JSON files, which is useful from an implementation point of view. It's not necessarily a good reason for doing them, but similarly, the APL user can read and write JSON files, and that I think is far more useful. If you want to create a configuration file and we use JSON, all you need to do is create a namespace, create in that namespace all your configuration settings and their values, and then write that out using quad JSON and quad input. Very easy way of creating a configuration file. So if we did that, this is what a configuration file might look like. That is pure JSON. It has got a single namespace, and all the items in there are just some examples of configuration settings that we already have. And the middle one I want to specifically point out because I haven't changed anything in that picture about how you might set the settings. But clearly, if we're using JSON, this is a 3-element array, and it would make much more sense if we specified that as a 3-element array of strings. So we might want to tweak with some things like that. That detail hasn't been thought about yet. But there are a few things about JSON which I don't personally like, but fortunately I think we can see past all of them. So let me offer you some thoughts. First of all, we said these were going to cascade. Well, there's absolutely no mechanism in JSON for doing that. But that's very easily supported by just putting an item inside the namespace called perhaps inherit or something equivalent, and that tells you what file has to be cascaded, and then the interpreter will cascade them. Okay, so we can solve that one. What else? This is me being very picky, but in JSON, the names of all items are actually specified as strings, and they're quoted. And that's all very well for a machine transfer language, but if you are human editing that, that's just a faff. I would rather not have to do that. So, well, there's an easy solution. Let's just not require them. But that, of course, that means we'll have to add an extension to the JSON parser to allow that. And there's another issue with JSON. It allows, well, it explicitly says that it is not defined what happens if you put the same item inside a namespace twice. So that could do anything. Theoretically, it could set it to 3G, but I don't think it would. Yeah, so I think clearly there would be no meaningful, that would never be meaningful in a configuration file. I think what we should do, if we ever get that, is to reject it as an error. That's not what the JSON parser currently does. It currently takes the last declaration, so we'd have to change that. And it does not support comments. So I think it will be very useful to be able to say that in your configuration file, which you've handwritten, what an option is, why it's there, and why you've set it to the value that you've set it. But JSON has no comment mechanism, which is probably the biggest problem with JSON that I've got. We could just allow comments and ignore them. But the problem with that is that what happens to those when you read them? If you read them in and you write the file back out again, they presumably get lost. So that's not such a good plan. A better plan maybe would be to allow anything to turn into a namespace of its own, having both a value and a description, and then use that as a technique for adding comments. That's currently my best thought, and that was suggested to me. But again, I'm not sure whether that's best, because that uses up a load of space in your namespace for comments. So anybody's got a better idea, I'd love to hear it. It's not supposed to come next. Oh, yeah, it is. Right, well, we're 10 minutes in, and I'm about 28 minutes into the actual slide, so we're doing well here. Okay, plenty of room for questions. Right, so the last remaining problem is case sensitivity. And this is a big problem, because at the moment our two systems are not compatible. We say on Windows documentation that the names have got all various different cases. I think when they were added, we thought, what is the most natural casing for this particular name? And they're all over the place. In fact, on Windows, you can specify them in whatever case you like, and the interpreter will accept them. And on Linux and other Unixes, you have to specify them in uppercase. So they're totally inconsistent. So now we have to decide in a configuration file, what do we do? They could be all in any case, as is currently the case on Windows. They could be all in uppercase, as currently the case on Unix. Or we could say that you have to follow the documentation exactly, which would be a bit of a nuisance for both platforms because it's different. We don't have a solution to this yet. My feeling is that we should allow it to be any case on all platforms. I'm getting a funny look from Jeff at the front. That's my feeling. We haven't worked this out. I'm being asked a question. I'll repeat it back.
It's a comment really. Then the namespace that got created when you read it with quad JSON.
The namespace that you read it when you created it with quad JSON. There's the issue. I think if we were to support it case insensitively, the JSON parser would have to fold all the names to a specific case, which then the lookups would be in that case. The problem is, if we wanted to have a mechanism of writing a file back out again, we would then change the case of everything that was in the original. So we might have to preserve the original as well. Yeah. So this is a conversation we've got to have and we haven't had yet. Another question? Yeah, please come to the front.
You made an array notation. Why? Now Dyalog have an array notation. Why we don't use this?
Well, that's a very good question. Why should we not use the array notation? Well, does anyone want to speak in favor or against the array notation? We've got no array notation parser in the interpreter yet, but we will have.
I think the main argument against that is one of the things you want to do here is to have a system that will integrate nicely with all your continuous integration toolkits and everything else that everybody else is using out in the world.
Right.
So we want to use a format that everybody will recognize and easily be able to manipulate. And our array notation does
That's true.
to that.
And with the JSON, you could edit it in any old editor that would recognize it as JSON. And some of those extensions that I was proposing for convenience would be an anathema to such editors, although you wouldn't have to use them. Oh, there's more people coming forward. Let's take questions. There's only a summary page left in the slides.
But if I wanted to comment on not using array notation, if you want to use JSON, then with other applications, then you cannot make your own extensions to it and like remove quotes and introduce comments and stuff like that. Because then other tools will break.
Yes, you're right.
Richard, you said that you had considered other file types other than just JSON,
Mm.
and then said the biggest benefit using JSON is allow you to have effective numeric data as well as strings.
No, I think the biggest benefit is the fact that people can easily create them by creating a namespace and putting the values in.
Okay, why not go back 30 years and use an ini file?
Well, ini-files was what the name of this project was initially called, ini-file. It's a contentious issue. Ini-files would do in the vast majority of cases. The only thing that ini-files are not very good at is blobs of binary data.
Can I encourage you, native-speaking English, to speak a little slower?
Oh, I'm sorry. I do babble when I come out the front. I thought I had got really slow, but obviously I haven't. Yeah, we have considered ini-files. Ini-files don't support blobs of binary data. Now, there are blobs of binary data in the registry, but whether you would want to use this mechanism to store blobs of binary data, I don't know. I knew that was going to get JD to the front.
An additional problem with ini files is if you want to define arrays of things or objects inside there, you then have to define your own syntax on top of what an ini file looks like to do things like that. And you know, JSON has all that stuff built in.
Yeah.
We've also, of course, got XML mechanisms inside the interpreter, and XML does allow comments.
Yeah.
Not
CSV
sure.
as well.
Well, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, CSV, you've got the same problem with defining what an object is and what an array is, but I think, you know, XML would do that as well. But, yeah, ini files. And again, with ini files, you have to then start writing parsers on all the platforms that don't have one built in. I mean, Windows has got an API for ini files, but the other platforms don't,
So you can see we're at a very early stage with this. And the advantage of being at a very early stage is that your feedback can be fed into the plans.
I was wondering, when do you want to read in a configuration file with comments in it and write it back out with the comments still intact?
That is a possibility if we use the mechanism for storing things that we currently use the registry for. Now, the Linux and AIX interpreters do not have a registry, and they don't write to any configuration files. But if they were to, and it was one of these, they may want to write them. But because those would be automatically generated and probably mostly hidden, you wouldn't really want to comment them anyway. Jeff.
Unix environment variables are case sensitive. We have just chosen to only put them in uppercase, right? And you can tell from the choice of them whether the guy who developed them was running on a Unix system or running on a Windows system, because the Windows guys put them in camel case and the Unix guys put underscores between the words. If we are going to persist with the existing names, we've got a problem.
Yeah.
I think that statement, if we're going to exist with the existing names, is a big question, and changing the case of the names is a lot easier thing to do than changing the names themselves.
Yes.
And just on the subject of case sensitivity, though, I think it would be insane to have different meanings to the same two names that differ only in case.
Yep, I agree.
So it's because it would be insane, Jeff. And therefore deciding to change the case as things were written back out again, for example, isn't ridiculous because you're not changing the meaning of the names that you're writing out and what you're reading in. So I would, you know, on the basis of what you said, I'd be in favour of mapping the case to something on the way in and writing it out as it should have been written in the first place.
So what's wrong with XML?
What's wrong with XML? Well, good, we've got plenty of time. What's wrong with XML? Well, XML's too clever for its own good in many respects. You would have to have a schema for this to be meaningful, I think. You would have to even not have a defined schema. You'd have to at least publish what it was. I don't know. XML really only carries character data. I think we would have, I mean, yes, you can define structures and things using XML, but then it becomes it's much more difficult to do that than with JSON, in my opinion. But, you know, it's still, if you think we should do XML, let's discuss that.
In favour of array notation,
Yeah.
Your objection, or somebody's objection, was, I think it was Morton, other systems, other products wouldn't be able to read it. Why the hell would they?
Well, presumably, Morton, I don't want to speak for you, but you mean things like editors and so on, do you?
Sorry? Well, I think you Notepad.
I mean, somebody who's putting together a complex system comprised of Dyalog APL and lots of other programming languages is going to have multiple configuration files for various parts of the system, and they're going to want to use other tools to manipulate these and diff them and edit them and so on.
Yeah.
So I think you really do want to have a widely used format.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's bothering me, JSON is very much the flavour of the month. Ini files, yeah, but ini files are old hat, and one of my objections to them is that they're old hat. Well, at some point, JSON will be old hat as well. So it's difficult to know what's a good option.
Okay, except in defense of the static typing world, XML still persists in exactly these situations for exactly the reasons that people are bringing up, in that the schema is an advantage when you're talking about multiple languages and environments, because the schema allows for a much more reliable communication over the structure of the stuff, which the JSON people have not done as compelling a job on. And most people can easily edit a sample XML configuration file, and they do on a number of systems. And the degree of structure that you have in these XML systems is very large and fairly machine readable and fairly machine checkable and all of these things. And if you want to prioritize the cross implementation features, then XML has a lot to lend itself over JSON. If you don't care about those, then the APL array notation has a lot to commend it. But the JSON stuff has a lot of issues with verification of the data. And so, you know, there is a lot to commend XML, even though it may be considered gross on some level.
Well, gross, I mean, it would be more difficult to create a configuration file if you had to start from scratch and write some XML.
But you never do that.
John said something. I didn't hear what you said, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that's a familiarity issue.
Yeah.
If you know XML and you don't know JSON, then I would definitely disagree with you. It's easy to write it in XML if you know how to write XML. I mean, there may be a little bit more typing, but it depends what you know.
No, but I mean, with JSON, you simply put in a namespace, so a couple of square braces, and then just named items. That's all it would be. XML would probably have a lot more structure than that.
Why not use both?
Yeah, you can also do both.
Yeah.
And it would be perfectly possible to do the same thing that you've done for JSON and map to XML as well,
Right.
with a formal schema for modeling that.
Yeah.
And you know, nobody's going to write the stuff from scratch, because you always include your standard configuration default in an XML or a JSON file already, and that's what they work off of.
Not another question. I think a lot of these files will be very, very short. They'll just say max was equals 5G, and then a reference to another file. They'll be tiny.
Somebody at the back shouted YAML, and I'll just pick up on that. That was another thought we had.
Except, Morton, that there is scope here to use these files for all sorts of things, including project specifications and so on, in which case they would become, potentially, they could become much larger in the future.
One point I didn't make as we went through is that we envisage you would be able to put things other than the interpreter settings in these files and use the getEnv method to read them, so they could configure your application as well. That might be of concern if we use another format. Cool.
Two questions. One is, what exactly is the downside of just allowing any case and doing what you need to internally to uppercase everything? And is there any downside? And the second question is, because that seems like the natural thing, just allow any case, any platform, and do what you need to do. And the second question is for Jason, if you want to have comments, maybe instead of insisting everything is an object, you allow a simple name. And if it's not a simple name and it's a space, then it has a name and a description. So that I don't need to, somebody who doesn't want to comment can keep it real simple.
Yeah, I didn't make that clear as I went through. When I showed the comment as an object, I didn't mean that you would have to do it that way, but it would be an option. Okay, good. I think that was that Gil that suggested? Somebody suggested it. Did you suggest that, Gil? Yeah, somebody at the back mentioned YAML. That's another one we've looked at. It seemed more powerful and more complex than we felt we needed, but it's something that we could do. I don't think we're that keen to write a whole YAML parser and writer in order to support this. Any more questions?
Would YAML deal with the comments problem? I mean, would you be able to round trip a YAML file?
I would have to go back and look again at the spec. I can't remember, but it is designed for writing configuration files, so I would hope so. Yes. Thank you. Somebody confirm yes.
What do other people do is the question. They use YAML and XML and JSON and any files and stuff.
Yeah.
And Lua? No, that's not a configuration. Huh.
Yeah.
I still like any files.
Yeah, Morton likes any files. As we are, I mean, as we are where we are on the development page, and you're all here, specifically in terms of JSON, who could be by show of hands just say who thinks it is a good thing, and then afterwards who thinks it's not? So start with is. Jason. So roughly a third of the room. Who? Oh no, maybe a couple more there. Third to a half. Who thinks it would be a bad thing, and something else? Anything else would be better.
Anything else? No, anything.
Well, they have a preference other than they've got something better.
XML.
Yes.
XML.
About the same number. Yeah. Any files, yeah, any files.
Any files.
Any files. Oh. It's interesting. What else have we suggested? YAML? Who wants YAML? Well, we're safe on YAML. Nobody wants that. Okay.
Okay, what time is it?
I'm due to finish. Oh yeah, array notation. We have one YAML. One array notation?
Oh, array
2 or 3.
notation.
Yeah, I could have guessed Adam. Yeah. Yeah. I don't think we're going to do multiple choice. I mean, we're not going to do many. You can do whatever you want. We're only going to settle on one. But
if it's JSON, it has to be case sensitive, and if it's any, it doesn't have to be. And
oh God.
Right.
Anyway.
I think we have slightly more than 30 minutes for coffee. Did you have more?
Well, I was just going to say, I had a summary slide which has got contact addresses, because if you want to follow up with any more requests, praises or insults, then there's some email addresses down the side which you can contact us on, and the forums. Well, this is probably not a good place for the forums, but you could use that as well, and we read it. John, were you trying to say one more thing?
I was only thinking of creative ideas for putting comments in, like, for example, and I'm not saying this is a good idea, but having a syntax that says this, any character after this one is ignored in a value. So, you know, if you had max was equals 1 GB.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, fine. No, I mean, it was a very quick one.
That's what happens when you think aloud.
Another one might be to say that, yeah, that's probably horrible too. No, all right, no, they're all horrible.
Yeah. Yeah, it has to be last. We're nearly there.
You can do the same thing for ride, so they're the same format?
Well, RIDE uses JSON, so that's settled it then. Good. Thank you very much. Thank you.